Well, there was certainly no glamour model or pinup whose career was more red hot in the 1950s than Tennessee's own Bettie Page. You may not recognize her name, but one look at Bettie with her signature black bangs and cheerful smile and, well, what little clothing she had on, and you'd remember seeing her image somewhere on everything from album covers to cigarette lighters. After her retirement from modeling in 1957, Bettie seemed to have all but vanished. But beginning in the 1970s and right up to today, and 10 years after her sad passing, her image is still red hot. But it's those missing years between 1957 and Bettie's reemergence in the 1990s that continues to fascinate her fans. Well, luckily for all of us, there's a new book co-authored by Tori and Bettie's nephew, Ron Brem, that sheds new light on Bettie's lost years, which is the title of the book. And it sheds that light through letters to her sister, Goldie. Tori also has another book out about Bettie called The Little Book of Bettie, and we'll talk about that in just a bit. Tori, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
And Ron Brem, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much.
I'd like to begin, Tori, with The Little Book of Bettie, because this is an unusual entry into the Bettie Page literary pantheon in that it's more of a how-to guide for people who want to capture the Bettie ethos. Do I have that right?
Yeah, you're exactly right, and it is. That's what I call it a pinup lifestyle guide that's inspired by Bettie, and it really illustrates how Bettie truly lives on through her fans, and this was a tribute to them as well as Bettie. And you may have noticed it includes, the section on the Bettie babes, which is what I call the gals that are influenced by Bettie and their lives and their appearance and that sort of thing. And it does include, lots of guidance on the various areas that Bettie was known for. So she was a rare woman in her day that worked out. She was really into fitness, even back in the 50s, and so it includes a section on Bettie-inspired fitness routines, which is how I created the workouts for my company, Bettie Page Fitness, as well. So each move in the workouts is based on a Bettie pose and really emphasizes like her great posture and core strength and other attributes that people really admire. And then the book also features tutorials on pinup hair and makeup and taps into like some of the DIY aesthetic that Bettie was really known for, and features some DIY pinup accessories that readers can make. But then also, as you noticed, does feature a bit of bio on Bettie as well, and talks about how she's really an icon of body positivity and self-acceptance, and talks about how lots of women have been inspired by her in those ways.
And I'm glad you mentioned the do-it-yourself attitude, because when Bettie got into modeling, there was no pinup shop that she could go to get those outfits. She had to make all of that stuff.
Right, absolutely. Yeah. And I think Ron would definitely be a good one to speak to that a bit, too, because his mom shared that same DIY passion.
Yeah, they certainly did. They both were quite adept at sewing their own costumes.
And they were both both very artsy and creative in several different ways.
Oh, absolutely. And we'll talk more about that relationship between the sisters when we start talking about the second book. But Tori, first I want to tell you how I became a Bettie Page fan and see if my story resonates with you. I wasn't old enough to experience Bettie in real time in the 1950s. I wasn't around at that time. But in the 1980s, I picked up a comic book, and in that comic book was a feature called The Rocketeer by Dave Stevens. And there was a drawing of this woman, several drawings of this woman, and I remember looking at this and thinking, this is the most beautiful woman I've ever seen in my life. And someone in the store said to me, that's based on a real person. And I said,
oh, wow.
There's no such person. No one could ever look as good as this. Well, it turns out I was wrong, and I became a Bettie Scout of America. I was getting the Bettie Pages Digest, and I was reading up as much as I could about Bettie. How about you?
Yeah, I discovered Bettie through the movie, The Notorious Bettie Page. Not the documentary, but the movie that preceded that.
Right, with Gretchen Mol.
And with Gretchen Mol. I was just like, it's kind of like you, like, what? I was like, this is a real person? What?
Right.
And so I'm like, it can't be true. So I looked her up, and that was definitely the start of going down many rabbit holes of Betty photos and Betty lore, and just learning everything I could about her. And I just really, so at first, of course, and this is how I kind of explain it, I think it's true for a lot of Betty fans. First, you're just blown away by the visual impact that she has. And that in itself is just really special and different, from anyone you've ever seen. And so that's really appealing. But then you learn about her and read interviews with her, and just learn about what a truly special person she was, and how much she went through, but she always remained hopeful, and I just found it really fascinating. And like I said, in the Little Book of Bettie in particular, she's just really, she's just real. She embodies all these dichotomies. She's just, she's lots of different things at once. Yeah. And so, and as humans are, we have lots of conflicting traits, and, we have a nice side and a mean side, and just all that stuff. And she just somehow was able to portray all those things at once.
And for you, Ron, it's a totally different experience because you didn't have to discover her because she was already there.
Right.
But to you, Ron, this is Aunt Bettie Page. Right? You have a very different.
That's exactly right. All of this is quite surreal to me. As I know Betty as just my Aunt Betty, who was a very sweet and very kind to me when I was a little fellow there, and I was just absolutely in shock when the first time I attended Viva Las Vegas, as I walked through the crowd and noticed all of the young ladies all having the what is known as the Betty bangs now, and they're all dressed up like my Aunt Betty, and it was just, it was just incredible. It was really quite an eye opener, and I don't even think that my mom Goldie, Betty's sister, I don't even think that my mom or Betty really truly realized the impact that Betty has had on the world.
Did you know that your Aunt Betty had this other career earlier in her life?
Well, in a roundabout way, yes. And actually, when I was quite young, I was aware that my mom and Betty both had done some modeling in the early days there, and they were always, my mom was really quite obsessed with taking photographs, it seemed, and I was always the young fellow holding the flash bulbs or had my finger on the trigger on the or on the shutter there, and we took so many photographs throughout my life. It was incredible. My mom and the family never really discussed just what kind of modeling they did. I knew they, had costumes and things because my mom continued to sew and actually continued to sew some of those type of costumes when I was a little fellow there. And throughout the years, I had little clues here and there that there was something that the family just didn't talk about. And we were taking some photographs at my grandma's birthday party, which was held at my Uncle Jack's house there in Nashville. And I remember everybody saying, Betty was, I was going to be in one of the photos there, and Betty came over and she was straightening my shirt and such, and they said, "Now you let Betty do that. She knows all about taking good photographs."
Oh, wow.
and I remember that really well, and that was just another one of the little clues as throughout my life that I recall quite well. And my mom, one day when I was 19 years old, she went up into the attic and brought down this box full of all these old magazines that she had saved from back in the 50s. And by the way, I still have all of those. They're
Wow.
She kept all of those things through her whole life, and she showed me those, and to put it mildly, it was quite an eye-opening experience.
Yeah, I can imagine. Sure. It was for everybody.
I'm sure it was.
One of many, many songs written about Bettie Page. That was Highway 13 with the song Hey Bettie from 1998. Our guests today are the nephew of Bettie Page, Ron Brem, and the co-author of this new book, Bettie Page, The Lost Years, Tori Rodriguez. And Ron, we were just talking about you discovering what your Aunt Bettie had done for a living prior to the 1960s. But when the Bettie Renaissance began in the 80s, I'm assuming it must have caught all of you off guard.
Yeah, that is true. I know even my mom and myself, we were kind of caught off guard by this whole thing. I happened to be watching TV one night and saw a program on television that featured my Aunt Bettie, and I'm looking at this, and I was just absolutely in shock. And the next thing I know, I'm looking at the screen, and there's a picture of me and my dad walking across the street with Bettie in Nashville, Tennessee, and I'm just kind of blown away by the whole thing. I remember going over and talking to my mom about it and telling her, and I eventually ended up with a VHS videotape I recorded of that particular program, and I took it over to my mom, and she played that over and over.
Aww, sweet.
Yeah, so it was just kind of, we were just seeing the tip of the iceberg there, to be honest.
So how do we get up to today? How did you meet and begin collaborating with Tori here?
Well, that was a very fortunate thing that happened from one of the fellows with CMG Worldwide. Actually, two of the fellows from CMG Worldwide. I had a meeting with them to discuss some of the cards and letters and all of these photographs that my mom had saved, all of her life, really. And I'm quite sure that she saved all of these things in hopes that I would someday do something with them and share them with the world. The fellows at CMG, after seeing all of these things, I had just brought a laptop with me, and they took a look at this, and they said, "We need to introduce you to Tori Rodriguez." And they told me that I also needed to attend the Viva Las Vegas Festival. And I had the very fortunate opportunity to meet Tori there in 2016. And I'd had an idea in my head a few years back there of the possibility of doing a book, and I mentioned that with the fellows at CMG. They thought it was a great idea.
And for you, Tori, seeing all of these letters and pictures that had never been published before and being able to work on a project like this must have seemed just unreal.
Definitely the ultimate dream come true, and I do want to definitely take the opportunity to just to say that the appreciation is definitely mutual, Ron, and we've talked before, about how it just couldn't have been a more perfect collaboration. We worked really well together, and it was really important. He really wanted to find someone who would treat the material with respect, and it was really important for me to do that. And but you're absolutely right. It was just like, oh my God. I mean, I don't think that. I mean, it sounds dramatic, but it really is it's like sacred treasures, like
right.
It was amazing to sit there and read that stuff. I mean, every time, but especially the first time Ron and I went out to California. We went on to his boat, and we're sitting on his boat looking through all these boxes with letters and photos and other mementos, and it was just a huge honor and extremely exciting.
Oh.
And these letters were sent over a period of years. How long of a span of time are we talking about?
Several decades. The first one is a card that she sent in 1949. And she's talking about, that one's particularly exciting, too, because she's talking about, that she's working with a modeling, like a fashion modeling agency, and she's really just getting her, career going and that sort of thing. And and then as Ron has said, and it always stands out, I always remember the way he said it. He said, she was pretty busy in the 50s, so you don't see any more letters until 1962, I believe it is where it picks up again. And then they're very consistent throughout the next several decades until the closing note, which is in 2000.
Was it difficult to create a narrative based around all of these letters?
It actually wasn't. I mean, that's the benefit of being obsessed with Bettie. coming into this as an obsessed Bettie fan was that I already had lots of kind of a broad overview of her bio and what was going on at different points in her life, and then having written the Little Book of Bettie. Prior to that, it was like really locked in. So that
right.
I had kind of had it mapped out, and then it was really neat to be able to get to read through those letters and say and just have the awareness of what else, what the bigger context was in one of those situations.
I was really impressed with just how descriptive Bettie is in these letters. I mean, she could have been a writer. She could have.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah,
and I'm glad you mentioned that, because that is absolutely one of the key things about the book that's so incredible is her penmanship, her writing skills, the level of detail that she would use to describe things. And I love how she describes her surroundings in nuanced detail. At each place that she moves to, she's talking about the plants in the yard and the wildlife, and just extremely intelligent lady.
We know that Bettie struggled with mental illness for a long time, but happily came out the other end okay. And I noticed that in these letters to her sister Goldie, she'll refer to those times when she was dealing with these issues as her nerves, and her nerves are acting up, struggling with her nerves. And I wonder if this was a case of Bettie maybe not knowing what was going on with her, or if this was just a term that was used at the time.
Yeah. It could have definitely. I think it could have easily been both, but I do think it had a lot to do with. And I mentioned this in the last years. Some is back then people definitely weren't talking about
Right.
And I was diagnosed with schizophrenia.
Right.
It was. I mean, people today don't want to share those things because there is still such stigma around mental illness, and particularly severe mental illness. And so, it could have been. I think it was, at least in part, just some of the euphemisms that were used back then for mental illness.
Yeah.
And it could have been, some denial on her part about accepting her condition. Yeah. And also, I love, toward the very end of the book, I think it's just a great closing statement from Bettie, and I think it's really inspiring for readers, is in a letter to Goldie, she's just talking about all that she learned about, the power of the mind to heal and the importance of, staying optimistic. And she's actually saying, she's I'll just read a few lines here. She says, expect good things to come to you. Chances are they will, just because you believe it. I've been reading a lot about the power of the mind to heal. Your mind influences every part of your body. You're only as old as you think. Your mind affects your body's ability to make itself sick or well. I know, and how you think results in how you feel. Unhappy emotions and poor self-image can lead to disease. And she says a lot more about that, but then she says, believe me, she said, maybe you should copy this and put it on your wall where you can read every day like I do. And she says, believe me, that's the best possible New Year's resolution you could make.
Wow, this is great stuff. And Ron, you just must be thrilled with this book.
Yeah, I'm just blown away at the wonderful job that she has done with everything, with the book. It's just a dream come true. And I know my mom...
I appreciate that so much, Ron.
I know my mom, Goldie, would just absolutely be proud as can be of it.
By the way,
Aw.
with regard to your mom, Goldie, Betty's sister, Goldie's kind of a knockout too. I mean, you've got basically two, and it's
Kind of.
it's an awkward thing to say to the son,
Right.
But I'm just saying here, far removed to thinking, boy, Goldie could have a career of her
That's
own.
one of the, super special things about this book, too, is that, throughout, because, one of the things I do is I manage the social media sites for Bettie Page, and, whenever the few pictures that were circulating before this book of Betty and Goldie, whenever I would post one of those, fans are always wanting to know, what happened to Goldie? Did Goldie ever model? We want to see more of Goldie. And so it was great to be able to provide more information about Goldie and just this, all these beautiful photographs, and really let people know what a special gal she was too.
Goldie Scouts of America, it's coming.
There you go.
Well, they're both great books. The Little Book of Bettie and Bettie Page, The Lost Years, available on Amazon.com, available in your local bookstore. And before we go, there's a great story in The Lost Years about Betty going to a concert, and she talks about how the singer came down from the podium and was singing to her, and how she was just flooded with emotion. And I just found that particular story to be very, very moving.
That was a very touching story, and just from memory, she had gone to an outdoor concert in the park, I believe, in California, and there was a cover band playing, and they played the song Lady, and of course, I went and looked up, the song Lady, and then of course there had to be several different ones called Lady, but
Right.
I decided it was the one that Kenny Rogers sang. But at some point during the song, he went over to Betty and I think grabbed her hand and was singing several of the lines to her, and she described in the letter how they were looking into each other's eyes, and sort of she felt like they were kind of both just thinking about longing for a love that they hadn't had before, that sort of thing.
Right.
Kind of the love that she was still yearning for, even in those later years.
Tori Rodriguez, Ron Brem, thanks so much for appearing on the show with us today.
Thank you so much.
Yes, it's really been my pleasure to share as much and bring some light to just who my Aunt Betty really was.